The rain was steady that evening. Not loud, not soft, just steady. The kind of rain that fills the silence without ever asking permission. I sat there in my car, parked a few houses away from where I was supposed to be, listening to the wipers drag across the windshield in slow, deliberate sweeps. The engine hummed beneath my palms, a quiet, trembling thing, steadying me when I wasn't. Sure, I could steady myself. I kept staring at the house, at the end of the road, the one with the warm light spilling from its windows and the kind of stillness that only belongs to homes untouched by struggle. Laughter flickered behind the glass like something too delicate for me to hold. For a moment, I wondered what it might feel like to live inside that kind of safety, the kind you don't have to earn, the kind that doesn't vanish when the bills come due. The clock on the dashboard glowed 6:47. I was already 12 minutes late. My reflection in the rearview mirror looked unfamiliar. Too careful, too composed. I reached for the scarf around my neck, adjusting it as though straightening fabric could fix the unease in my chest. My hands were trembling, not from fear exactly, but from something quieter. The ache of wanting to belong. It wasn't the first time I'd told myself a story before walking into a room. I'd learned long ago that people didn't see you for who you were. They saw you for what they thought you were missing. So tonight I decided to make the missing part visible, to let them believe I was struggling, just enough to seem harmless, just enough to be welcomed. The lie wasn't born out of deceit. It was born out of exhaustion. The kind that comes from always having to explain yourself, always proving that your survival wasn't luck, but labor. I was tired of that look, the one people give when they're impressed that you've managed. As if being whole after hardship makes you a curiosity, not a person. So tonight, I chose the version of me that they could handle. The woman with worn shoes. The one who saves leftovers. The one who apologizes when she hasn't done anything wrong. I told myself it was mercy, not manipulation. A small, harmless disguise in exchange for peace. Outside, the rain began to slow. The sky turning that soft blue-gray that feels like a sigh. The world was still, but my thoughts weren't. What if they could tell? What if Daniel's mother saw through me the way mothers do, sensing the tiny tremors in a person's truth? I looked down at my hands again. They were calloused, strong, and clean. Hands that had built a life from the quiet corners of survival. They didn't belong to a woman pretending to struggle. They belonged to someone who had learned the hard way that struggle and strength often share the same face. For a moment, I thought about driving away. Just putting the car in gear and letting the road take me somewhere else. Somewhere simpler. Somewhere that didn't ask for performance. But love, even when fragile, has a way of anchoring you. Daniel was kind, gentle. The kind of man who said, "They'll love you, you'll see." I wanted to believe him. Maybe I even did. But belief doesn't quiet the kind of fear that lives deep. The fear of being too much, or not enough. The fear that honesty might be too heavy for someone else's grace. A drop of rain slid down the glass, splitting the reflection of the house in two. It looked like a photograph torn down the middle. Two lives, almost touching, never quite aligned. That's what I felt like, split between who I was and who I thought I needed to be. The sound of the engine changed slightly. A low hum that almost sounded like a sigh. I turned the key and let it rest, the silence pressing against the air like a heartbeat waiting to be heard. The quiet felt heavy now, almost intimate. I closed my eyes, took one long breath. Maybe this was what truth felt like. Not a confession, but a choice. The choice to step into a version of yourself you're not sure you'll recognize later. When I opened my eyes, the porch light of the house flickered on. A signal, perhaps, or maybe just coincidence. Either way, it felt like the world had made the decision for me. I reached for my bag, the old one, frayed at the edges, chosen carefully to tell a story that wasn't entirely mine. I wiped the fog from the windshield with my sleeve. The glass cleared slowly, revealing the house again. Steady, warm, waiting. I told myself this was just a small lie. Harmless. A way to bridge the distance between worlds that rarely meet. But deep down, I knew the smallest lies often echo the loudest. Not in the world outside, but inside the quiet corners of your own heart. I stepped out of the car. The air smelled of rain and possibility, sharp and clean. My shoes sank slightly into the wet ground as I walked toward the porch. Each step felt like an admission. Soft, deliberate, irreversible. When I reached the door, I paused, my reflection faint in the glass panel. Behind it, laughter rose again. The kind that sounds like home to people who've never lost one. I lifted my hand, hesitated, then knocked. Once. Twice. For a moment, there was nothing. Just the sound of the rain gathering itself again. The quiet hum of a world unaware that something small but irreversible had just begun. And as I waited there, my heart whispering the truth I hadn't spoken aloud, I realized something simple and terrifying. This wasn't a lie meant to deceive others. It was a lie meant to make love easier. But love, I would soon learn, doesn't live where pretending does. It waits, patiently, for the day you show up as yourself. I grew up in a one-room apartment that smelled of boiled rice and kerosene. The kind of place where walls held stories, not secrets, and every object carried two purposes, one for use and one for survival. The ceiling fan creaked on humid nights, and when it rained, the sound on the tin roof above us was so loud, it almost drowned out the ache of living. My mother worked quietly, always quietly. There was something sacred about the way she moved through our days. Her hands red from washing, her back bent from mending clothes that weren't ours. She never complained. She just smiled, that small, steady smile that said, "We're okay," even when we weren't. That smile became my first lesson. She used to say, "People don't need to know your hunger, child. Feed them your kindness instead." At the time, I didn't understand. I thought she meant to hide. Later, I realized she meant to survive. Poverty didn't just teach me how to live with less. It taught me how to carry dignity like armor. When your life is weighed and measured by others, you learn early that silence is protection. You learn to nod, to agree, to be grateful for things you never asked for. There were days when we had only rice and salt for dinner. My mother would hum while cooking, her voice trembling softly through the steam. I'd sit at the small wooden table, watching her shape scarcity into comfort. She'd smile as she handed me the bowl, saying, "It tastes better when you eat it slowly." It never really did. But somehow, I always smiled back. That's what poverty does. It teaches you how to make beauty out of what hurts, how to laugh at the wrong time just to remind yourself you're still human. When I was 12, I remember standing outside a bakery, watching the glass fog from the warmth inside. The smell of sugar and butter floated through the crack in the door. I wanted to step in, not to buy anything, just to be near that feeling of enoughness. But I didn't. I turned away, smiling, because that's what I'd learned to do, to cover longing with grace. Years later, when I started working, long hours, small pay, that habit followed me. Smile even when it hurts. Smile, even when people assume you need saving. Smile, so they don't feel guilty for what they have and you don't. And so I smiled, through unpaid bills, through nights of exhaustion, through moments when I wanted to scream, because somewhere deep inside, I believed that showing pain was selfish, that it would make others uncomfortable. I think about that a lot now. How easy it is to mistake endurance for peace. When my son was born, everything changed, and nothing did. He became my reason to keep moving, to keep smiling, even when the world felt too heavy to carry. I remember holding him one night when the lights went out, rocking him in the dark, whispering stories I made up on the spot. Outside, thunder rolled. Inside, I pretended we were in a ship sailing somewhere warm, somewhere safe. He giggled in his sleep, and in that tiny sound, I found my strength. Because that's what motherhood does. It turns every ache into a promise. We made it through those years, barely. I sold what I could, worked what I found, stitched what was torn. There were times I wanted to give up, to rest. But rest is a luxury when you're the only thing standing between your child and hunger. When people later told me, "You're so strong," I wanted to tell them the truth. that strength isn't noble. It's just what's left when there's no other choice. But I didn't say that. I just smiled. Over time, I built a small life, steady, modest enough. I opened a little shop, one that smelled of fabric and soap. Nothing fancy, just mine. People came and went. They saw a woman behind a counter, calm and capable, never knowing that behind that calm lived years of scarcity stitched into the seams of her soul. When Daniel came into my life, he didn't come with promises. He came with gentleness, the kind that doesn't announce itself, just stays. He asked me out for coffee and I almost said no, not because I didn't want to, but because I didn't know how to belong in someone else's world. On our first date, he ordered something I couldn't pronounce. I ordered tea, simple, familiar. I remember how he looked at me, not pitying, not curious, just present. That look was disarming. For once, I didn't feel like I was being measured. But as the months passed, I noticed small things. Not from him, but from the world around him. The restaurants, the clothes, the way his friends spoke casually about vacations as if everyone had them. I smiled through it the way I always did. But inside, I felt that quiet distance. The kind poverty leaves behind even when you've escaped it. When he introduced me to his family, something inside me trembled. Not because I doubted their kindness, but because I doubted my belonging. I'd built a life out of modest truth, but sometimes truth feels too plain to be accepted. That's when the old instinct returned. The smile, the silence, the shrinking. When poverty teaches you how to smile, it doesn't teach you how to stop, even when you no longer need to. I told Daniel I wanted to make a good impression. He said, just be yourself. But what he didn't understand was that being myself had always been complicated. Myself was a woman who came from less, who worked too hard, who carried too much. And sometimes the world doesn't want to meet that woman. It wants the story of her, softened around the edges. So I ironed my old cardigan, chose the modest purse, and decided that maybe being small would make things easier. I told myself it was humility. But in truth, it was fear. The fear of taking up too much space at someone else's table. I think my mother would have understood. She would have said, sometimes silence feeds peace. But she never told me that silence can also starve honesty. There's a moment, before every big mistake, where your heart knows. It whispers, don't do this. But sometimes you love peace so much, you're willing to betray yourself for it. That night, in the car, before I knocked on their door, I remembered my mother's voice and her smile. The one that held the world together, and I smiled too. Not because I felt ready, but because that's what I'd been taught to do when life began to tremble. I didn't know it then, but the smile I carried into that house would be the same one I'd learned to let go of, piece by piece, until what was left wasn't pretense, but truth. Because the real lesson poverty taught me wasn't how to hide pain. It was how to recognize love when it didn't demand pretending. The first thing I noticed was the shine. The table gleamed like still water, its surface catching the chandelier light in perfect reflection. Everything in that room seemed to have been polished to a quiet kind of perfection. The silverware, the glass, even the laughter. It wasn't loud laughter, not the kind that fills a room. It was the kind that drifts carefully, the way people speak when they know someone's listening. I stood there for a moment before sitting down, adjusting my sleeves, pretending to admire the floral centerpiece when really, I was just buying time. Time to remember which version of myself I'd chosen to be that evening. The humble one. The one who didn't have much but tried anyway. The one people could approve of without feeling threatened. The seat they offered me felt softer than I expected. It almost made me nervous to sit. I folded my hands on my lap, smiled and told myself, just breathe. Daniel's family spoke easily. They knew which stories to tell, when to laugh, how to make space for silence without letting it feel awkward. I watched them, learning the rhythm. The mother's bracelets chimed softly every time she reached for her glass. The father cleared his throat before every sentence, as though everything he said had weight. The sister smiled too quickly, the kind of smile that never reached her eyes. And then there was me. Trying to look comfortable while the sound of cutlery on porcelain reminded me of everything I wasn't. When his mother asked what I did, I hesitated just long enough for it to sound natural. "Oh," I said lightly, "I just help with things here and there. Little jobs. Keeps me busy." The lie slid out easily. Practiced. Almost gentle. She smiled, polite but thin. The kind of smile that said she was listening, but not curious. I thought of my small business, the one I'd built from the ground up. The shop that smelled of fabric and effort. I could have told her about it. The pride, the exhaustion, the little victories. But the words felt too heavy for this table. I was afraid that if I placed my truth here, it would clatter too loudly, disturb the careful balance of their world. So I stayed small. I let my silence protect their comfort. The food was delicate, soft fish, roasted vegetables arranged like art. I ate slowly, quietly, aware of every sound I made. It's strange how in some rooms you can hear your own breathing. I smiled when they spoke, nodded when they laughed, and somewhere deep inside, I felt myself drifting away, watching from a distance, like a guest in my own story. Then came the small things. The sister asking where I bought my dress, her voice coated in sweetness but her eyes sharp. The father's casual glance when I mentioned my son, the flicker of surprise that never made it to his mouth. The mother's subtle shift in tone when she said, "It's so inspiring when women manage on their own." Inspiring. That word always cuts both ways. It sounds like praise, but underneath it whispers different. Other, less. I smiled again, the same smile my mother wore when the landlord raised the rent. Soft, understanding, undeserving of anger. At one point, I reached for my glass and caught my reflection in its curve, my hands trembling just slightly, the tension hidden beneath practiced calm. And I thought, this isn't me, but it was. It was the version I had created, carefully, fearfully, because I wanted so badly to belong. The conversation moved on. They talked about vacations, about the new development opening near the lake. I nodded at the right times, though I had nothing to add. My silence filled the spaces between their words like background music, pleasant, unintrusive. When the grandmother spoke, her voice was softer than the rest. She hadn't said much all evening. She just watched, her eyes gentle but knowing, the kind of eyes that had seen too much of life to be fooled by polish. "You remind me of myself," she said suddenly. Everyone turned to her. Her smile was slow, kind. The ones who come from less often have the kindest hearts. The room went still for a second, just long enough for me to feel the compliment settle somewhere deep, and then ache. Kindest hearts. I should have felt grateful. Instead, I felt small, because kindness was all I was being allowed to be. That moment stayed with me long after dessert, a delicate crumble that I barely tasted. The sound of cutlery, the polite laughter, the warmth of the chandelier. They all blended into something that felt distant, like watching life through a window. When dinner ended, Daniel squeezed my hand gently under the table. His touch was soft, reassuring, and it almost broke me, because he didn't know. He didn't know that the woman sitting beside him had spent the entire evening pretending to be someone easier to accept. Outside, the air was cool. The night smelled faintly of jasmine and rain. I stood beside the car for a moment, breathing it in, trying to shake the heaviness in my chest. The sound of laughter drifted from the house, fading as the door closed behind them. I wanted to believe it went well, that I'd done what I came to do, fit in, blend, belong. But as I looked at my reflection in the car window, all I saw was the outline of someone who'd traded honesty for approval. When I got home, I sat on the edge of the bed and took off my cardigan slowly, as if peeling away the night. The silence was deafening. My son's toys were scattered across the floor, a quiet reminder of who I really was. Not the version I'd shown them, but the woman who built a life from her own hands. I stared at my reflection again, this time in the dark window. The same face, the same tired eyes, but something inside me had shifted. A small, invisible crack had formed. It wasn't regret. Not yet, just awareness. The weight of that polished table, its gleam, its order, its quiet power, had followed me home. It sat somewhere behind my ribs, pressing softly, reminding me that I had tried to sit in a place that didn't feel like mine. That night, before I went to bed, I whispered something I hadn't said in years. I'm tired of pretending. The words barely left my lips, but once they did, they echoed quietly in the room, fragile, trembling, free, and even though no one heard them, I did. And that was the beginning of everything that came next. It happened on a quiet afternoon, the kind that doesn't warn you before changing everything. The sky was soft and pale, a hint of sunlight pushing through thin clouds. My little apartment smelled faintly of detergent and warm rice. I was folding laundry in the living room when the knock came. 3 gentle taps, almost polite. I thought it was the delivery man. I wasn't expecting anyone else. When I opened the door, Daniel stood there. His shirt sleeves were rolled up, his expression uncertain. There was no smile this time, only a look that told me he knew something I didn't want him to know. He stepped inside quietly, eyes scanning the room, the toys on the floor, the chipped paint on the wall, the faded curtains. He'd never been here before. I had kept this part of my world away, afraid it might change the way he saw me. "Why didn't you tell me?" he said softly. There was no anger in his voice. That made it worse. Anger, at least, you can defend yourself from. Kindness leaves no place to hide. I froze. My hand still held the half-folded shirt. I tried to speak, but the words tangled somewhere between guilt and fear. He walked deeper into the room, touching the corner of the table and the photo frame of my son smiling in his school uniform. "You work so hard, May," he said. "Why did you pretend you didn't?" The question was simple. The truth wasn't. I sat down slowly, the air heavy between us. Because I thought... I paused. I thought your family wouldn't understand. That they'd think I wasn't... enough? He finished for me. I nodded. He sighed, running his hand through his hair. My mother told me she did a little checking. That sentence was a knife wrapped in velvet. Checking. The word sounded harmless, but I knew what it meant. She'd looked into me, into my life, my job, and my home, into the truth I'd tried so carefully to soften. "She found out about your shop," he said quietly. "That you own it. That it's successful." I waited for him to say more, for the judgment, the disappointment, and the accusation. But instead, he just looked at me, eyes full of something I couldn't quite name. "Why would you hide something like that?" "Because pride wears different clothes when it's afraid. Because sometimes people don't want to see strength when they've already decided to pity you. Because I wanted love, not admiration. I didn't want them to see me as a threat," I said. My voice broke on the last word. I've spent my whole life being too much or too little for someone. I just wanted, for once, to be acceptable. Silence filled the room like fog. Daniel sat across from me, elbows on his knees, face buried in his hands. He wasn't angry, but he was hurt, confused, maybe even betrayed. And that cut deeper than anger ever could. Finally, he looked up. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "I wanted them to love you for who you are." I laughed softly, not from humor, but from the painful irony of it. "That's the problem, Daniel. I don't even know who that is anymore." He reached for my hand, but I couldn't take it. Not yet. Not when everything inside me was unraveling. The afternoon light shifted, washing the room in gold and shadow. The hum of the ceiling fan filled the silence between us. My son's laughter echoed faintly from the next room, a cruel reminder of innocence untouched by all this pretending. Daniel stood up slowly. "I'll talk to them," he said. "They'll understand." But I shook my head. "No. They'll forgive. That's not the same. Forgiveness comes easy when you're the one being fooled. Understanding takes a kind of empathy that polished hearts rarely carry." He hesitated, then nodded, a silent surrender. He walked toward the door, stopped for a moment, and turned back. You don't have to be smaller to fit somewhere, May. The right people will make space. And then he left. When the door closed, the sound was soft but final, like the click of a lock you didn't realize existed. I stood there, staring at the empty space where he had been, feeling the weight of every lie I had told press against my chest. The mask I had worn for so long, the careful smile, the lowered eyes, the gentle humility, finally cracked. Not in anger, not in shame, but in exhaustion. I sank to the floor, the laundry still unfinished beside me. The silence was heavy, almost kind. I could hear the faint ticking of the clock and the whisper of wind against the window. For the first time in a long while, I didn't try to fix it. I didn't try to explain or justify. I just sat there and let the truth breathe. I thought of all the women I'd known, mothers, sisters, workers, who had learned to fold themselves into smaller versions so others could feel comfortable around them. Women who laughed when they were underestimated, who stayed quiet when they were hurt, and who pretended to need saving because the world preferred them that way. And I realized I had become one of them. Not because I was weak, but because I was tired of being punished for being strong. As the afternoon faded into evening, the golden light turned silver. I could see my reflection in the window again, softer, less certain, but finally real. The mask had fallen apart, yes. But beneath it, for the first time, there was someone I recognized. The next morning arrived quietly, like a guest who didn't want to disturb the house. The air smelled of yesterday's rain, and the world outside my window seemed softer, too gentle for how heavy I felt inside. Daniel hadn't called. I hadn't either. The silence between us wasn't angry or final, just waiting, like two hearts standing on opposite shores, watching the same tide roll in, unsure who would step first. I made breakfast for my son. Eggs, toast, milk, the small rituals of normal life that keep you from breaking. He hummed a tune from his favorite cartoon, unaware that the woman across the table was quietly rearranging her entire understanding of herself. After he left for school, I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the blank page of my journal. The cold sunlight pooled across it like a spotlight, as if inviting me to confess, so I began to write. At first, it wasn't a letter. It was a list of small truths I'd hidden. The lies too gentle to sound cruel, but heavy enough to change a heart. I said my shop was part-time. It isn't. I said I rent this place. I own it. I said I struggle. I don't. Not anymore. Each line made me smaller and freer at the same time. Then the writing changed. The words began to take the shape of something softer. A letter. Not for Daniel, not really. But for the woman I used to be. The one who thought being loved meant being less. Dear you, I wrote. You've spent your life trying to be palatable. Not too proud, not too loud, not too much. You've worn humility like armor. And every time someone mistook it for weakness, you smiled. Because it was safer that way. I paused. The clock ticked. A bird sang outside. 3 quick notes, clear as glass. You learned early that people prefer women who struggle quietly. I continued. The ones who thank others for crumbs, who never ask for the whole loaf. You thought that if you were soft enough, small enough, grateful enough, you'd be kept. But love built on pity isn't love. It's control disguised as kindness. My hands trembled as I wrote. Each word felt like digging up old roots, painful, necessary, freeing. I thought of my mother, her bent back, her tired smile, the way she used to whisper, "Never make people uncomfortable with your strength." She believed that being agreeable was survival. She wasn't wrong. but she never saw what that kind of survival costs. I had inherited that silence like an heirloom, polished, familiar, heavy. Now, I wanted to give it back. By afternoon, the letter had grown longer. Pages of reflection, fragments of memory, small apologies to myself and to the world. I wasn't writing to fix anything. I was writing to understand. At one point, I wrote Daniel's name, then crossed it out. He wasn't the villain. He wasn't the test. He was just the mirror. And for the first time, I didn't flinch from what it showed me. When the sun began to dip, I made tea. Jasmine, my mother's favorite. I sat by the window, watching the shadows lengthen across the floor. The letter lay open on the table, pages curling slightly at the edges. I thought about sending it. About letting Daniel's family read it. About letting them see what it costs a woman to fit inside their quiet expectations. But I didn't. Because some truths aren't meant to be explained, only lived. Instead, I folded the pages carefully, pressed them flat between my palms, and slipped them into an old wooden box. The one where I kept photos, birth certificates, the first drawing my son ever made. As I closed the lid, I whispered to the empty room, "This isn't goodbye. It's an understanding." Then I smiled. Not the polite, practiced smile I had worn at their dinner table, but a small, private one. The kind that blooms when you finally stop apologizing for existing as you are. That night, I tucked my son into bed. He looked at me sleepily and said, "Mama, you're smiling different." I brushed his hair back, laughed softly, and said, "Maybe I am." After he fell asleep, I went back to my journal. The last page of the letter was still blank. So I added one final line. The truth doesn't need to be sent to anyone. It just needs to be seen. By the one who's been hiding from it. When I put down the pen, I felt lighter. Not because I had been forgiven, but because I had finally forgiven myself. Outside, the rain began again, gentle, rhythmic, almost kind. I closed my eyes and let the sound fill the room, thinking how strange it was that peace could come not from fixing what was broken, but from finally letting it be. Tomorrow, I knew, there would be conversations to have, maybe even pain to face. But tonight, there was calm. And for the first time in a long while, that was enough. Weeks passed quietly. The air had changed. Lighter somehow, though nothing in my life had outwardly shifted. The days moved softly, one folding into the next. I worked, I cooked, I laughed with my son. But inside, something subtle had begun to heal. The ache that used to hum beneath every gesture now replaced by something steadier, something that almost felt like peace. One morning, Daniel called. His voice was gentle, unsure. He didn't mention the lie, or the silence that followed it. He simply asked, "Would you and your son come for dinner this weekend?" For a long moment, I said nothing. My heart stilled. The old fear stirred, that reflex to perform, to prepare a version of myself that would be safe to show. But then, I looked at the letter still tucked inside the wooden box on my shelf. I thought about the woman who had written it, tired of pretending, tired of asking permission to belong. So I said yes. But this time I would go as myself. The evening arrived soft and golden, the kind of early dusk that makes the world look forgiving. I wore my favorite blue dress, not the one that tried to say simple, not the one that tried to say proper, just the one that felt like me. My son picked wildflowers from the park and insisted we bring them. Their colors, pink, yellow, white, felt brave in my hands. The drive was quiet. The sound of the engine wasn't heavy anymore. It was steady, familiar. The road stretched before us like a memory finally willing to be rewritten. When we reached the house, the lights were already on. Through the window I could see movement, silhouettes setting the table, laughter spilling faintly through the glass. My chest tightened, but not from fear, from something like anticipation. Daniel met us at the door. His eyes softened when he saw me. There was no speech, no apology, just a quiet nod, the kind that says, "We both know what this moment means." He took my hand and led us inside. The dining room looked the same. The polished table, the candles, the soft hum of conversation. But the air was different, lighter, human. Daniel's mother smiled when she saw me, and this time it reached her eyes. She hugged my son first, then me. Her arms were tentative but warm. "I'm glad you came," she said, just that. No weight hidden behind the words. We sat down together. At first, it was awkward, the kind of silence that trembles with unspoken things. But then the grandmother spoke up, her voice calm and kind. "I've always believed that truth makes the best meal. It might not be fancy, but it always fills the soul." Everyone chuckled softly, the tension thinning like mist in sunlight. I exhaled. We began to eat. The food was simple, comforting. Roasted chicken, soft bread, a salad full of color. My son's laughter carried across the table, and even Daniel's father, who once seemed made of stone, smiled at him. At one point, Daniel's sister asked about my work. The question was sincere this time, curious, not cautious. I told them what I did. I spoke plainly, honestly about how I started, how it grew, how proud I was. The words felt strange at first, like sunlight on skin that had only known shade. But then it felt good, natural. Daniel's mother listened. When I finished, she said softly, "You've done well for yourself." No comparison. No distance, just acknowledgement. I nodded, smiled. I've had to. For the first time, I noticed the sound of the house. Forks clinking, someone pouring wine, the faint creak of the old wooden chair beneath me. It was the sound of ordinary life, the sound of belonging, if you listened closely enough. Midway through dinner, Daniel reached under the table and took my hand. His fingers were warm, sure. No words were needed. We weren't erasing the past. We were quietly rewriting its meaning. When dessert came, the pie I'd baked that morning, flaky and imperfect but mine. His mother took a bite, smiled and said, "You must give me the recipe." I laughed. Genuinely, the sound spilling out unguarded. "It's mostly instinct," I said. "And a little stubbornness." The grandmother chuckled softly. The best kind of recipe. The laughter that followed wasn't loud, but it was real. It filled the space that used to feel like a test and turned it into something else entirely. Home. Later, as we cleared the dishes, Daniel's sister came to stand beside me at the sink. The warm water ran between us as she rinsed the plates. After a while, she said quietly, "I used to think people like you were so strong, but maybe strength looks softer than I realized." I looked at her, surprised, then smiled. Maybe it does. When we were leaving, Daniel's mother handed my son a small bag of cookies wrapped in cloth. "For tomorrow," she said. Then, after a pause, "For both of you." I met her eyes, and for the first time, there was no judgment, only warmth. The drive home was silent, but not empty. My son fell asleep in the back seat, his head tilted against the window. The city lights passed over his face in flickers, gold, white, gold. I thought about that first night, how I'd sat in this same car, heart pounding, pretending to be someone smaller. Now the silence felt different, peaceful, earned. When I pulled into my driveway, I didn't rush to turn off the engine. I just sat there for a moment, listening to it hum softly, steady and alive. It was the same sound that once carried fear. Now, it carried me home. Inside, I laid my son in bed, kissed his forehead, and lingered in the doorway. The moonlight brushed his cheeks, and I thought, maybe this was it. Not perfection, not approval, but peace. The kind you find only when you stop shrinking for others. I went to my desk, opened my journal, and wrote one simple sentence. Tonight, I was not pretending. And still, I was loved. Then I closed the book and let the quiet fill the room. Somewhere in the distance, a train passed. A low, steady sound, like a heartbeat moving forward. And for the first time in a long while, I knew I didn't need to become anyone else to deserve this life. I just needed to show up as myself. The house is quiet now. Only the hum of the refrigerator and the distant rhythm of rain tapping against the window remain. The day has folded itself neatly into night, and the warmth of the dinner lingers somewhere in the corners of my heart. A gentle echo of laughter. The clinking of glasses, the sound of my son's small joy. I sit by the window, the same way I used to when I couldn't sleep, but tonight feels different. The glass isn't a wall anymore. It's a reflection, one that finally looks back at me without distortion. The streetlight outside spills through the curtain in soft gold lines, painting my notebook, my hands, the cup of tea cooling beside me. I breathe slowly. The air smells like rain and pie crust and a little forgiveness. I open my journal, the same one that carried all the weight of my pretending. The lies, the fear, the quiet shame I used to name as survival. The pages are half filled, the ink uneven in places where my hands once trembled. But tonight the writing comes easily. I start simply. Tonight, I came home to myself. I pause, watching the words settle like dust in warm light. For years I thought being accepted meant becoming someone people could understand, but I see it differently now. The ones who truly care don't need you to explain. They just stay, and those who can't, well, their leaving was never the tragedy I thought it was. Outside, a single streetlight flickers. Somewhere a car passes, its tires whispering through the wet road. The sound reminds me of that first night. The trembling engine, the false courage I wrapped around myself like armor. I almost smile at the memory. It feels like watching an old version of me in a faded film. A woman trying so hard to be small enough to be loved. But I know better now. I've learned that love built on pretense may start softly, but it always cracks under silence. The truth, though fragile, has a strange kind of strength. It bends but doesn't break. It stands quietly in the corner, waiting for us to be brave enough to return to it. My son stirs in his sleep. I glance toward his room, the faint light catching on his hair. I think about the kind of example I want to leave behind for him. Not perfection, not endless sacrifice, but honesty. The kind that lets him say, "This is who I am," without flinching. I think of my mother, too, her tired hands, her quiet lessons stitched into the fabric of my life. She taught me how to endure, but perhaps what she couldn't teach, because she never had the chance to learn, was how to rest. To live not just as someone surviving, but as someone enough. The rain softens. In its hush, I can almost hear her voice. Not as a ghost, but as a comfort. "You did well," she might have said. "You found your way back." I close my eyes. The quiet feels alive tonight, almost sacred. This house, this window, this simple moment, it doesn't need grand gestures to be whole. It just needs truth. And in that truth, I find something I hadn't known I was missing. Grace. Not the kind that comes from others, but the quiet grace of forgiving myself, for hiding, for pretending, for thinking I had to earn what was already mine. I sip my tea, now lukewarm, and smile faintly. Life doesn't need to end in applause or clarity. Sometimes, peace is just the soft landing after years of falling. I pick up my pen again and write one last line. Not for the world, but for the woman I used to be. You don't have to be seen to be real. You only have to stop hiding. I close the notebook. The sound is small, final, like a sigh. The lamp beside me hums faintly. The light glows against the window pane, catching droplets of rain like tiny pieces of memory. I can see my reflection there, older, softer, but somehow freer. The night outside is deep and wide. I let my gaze drift across the horizon, where the faintest trace of dawn already begins to blur the edge of darkness. The world, as always, moves forward, and so do I. Maybe that's the real truth. Not the one we tell others, but the one that slowly reveals itself in quiet rooms, under soft light, when no one's watching. It doesn't demand forgiveness. It just asks to be understood. I rest my hand on the window frame, the cool glass against my fingertips, and whisper into the stillness. I'm here now. As I am. And for the first time, that feels like enough. The rain finally stops. Somewhere in the distance, a bird stirs, a fragile note in the soft breath before morning. The story doesn't need an ending. It already has one, written in the light on my hands, the calm in my chest, and the quiet truth I no longer have to hide. Because sometimes, becoming honest isn't about being believed. It's about finally believing yourself.